I want to keep this casual. Got it. I'm going to keep this casual, and I'm going to say that because I'm splitting my screen, because I have my notes on half the screen and you guys on half the screen, I can't see all of you at the same time. So if you can, please hold your questions until question time. But if there's something you truly don't understand and want to interrupt, just holler at me because I might not see you if you raise your hand. Okay. Um, this is part of a series of talks, as Gary said, I've given in the past. This one is on story structure, and this particular talk is on your beginning, setting your scenes, backstory and flashbacks, and your ending. And I would just say, you know, Gary told you really enough about me, but I will say that I started writing screenplays. I had some very impressive meetings with some very name drop people in some very nice places, but none of my screenplays ever got made. And then I started writing for television, and I wrote my first TV script for Star Trek Voyager, and 6 weeks later I was watching it with my friends, and I thought I like this better, and I wrote for television for on a number of shows for a number of years. But I had taken the first screenplay I wrote, the first screenplay that was optioned, the first screenplay that went to three different studios and got rewritten until it was something I didn't even recognize anymore. I thought to myself, when I got the rights back, I thought I'm going to write the novel because nobody can mess with if I write the novel. And that was my first novel. And one of the things, as I continued to write television and continued to teach television, this realization just rose up in me, which is it's all the same. As Gary was saying, the lessons I taught to novel writers about dialogue, I learned writing television. How to create tension is how to format your characters, how to show and not tell. All of the rules that we've heard about writing, it doesn't matter if you're writing a movie, if you're writing television, if you're writing a novel, if you're writing a short story, it all applies. It's all about the story and the craft of how you put together the pieces of that story and the characters and blah, blah, blah. So this is about structure, as I said, your beginning, setting your scenes, backstory, and flashbacks. So, your beginning. How do you decide where your story starts? I should start by saying probably most of you or many of you are familiar with Joseph Campbell's work about story, about writing, the hero's journey, and many of the other books he wrote. And I'm a big devotee of his. And to butcher what he would have said about it, I believe we are all innate storytellers. I believe that telling stories around the campfire when we were Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal helped us survive as a species and is in our blood. I believe we are all literal natural born storytellers. So you already know how to tell a story. What I'm here to do is tell you how to craft that story. And because you already know how to tell a story, you probably innately already know where your story should begin. But here's one way to tell. If you were that famous, again, back to the industry that Gary and I were talking about, that famous industry comment on the elevator pitch. If you were to give an elevator pitch about your story, which is, some people call it a log line, some people call it other things, but in essence, a sentence or two about what your story is about, what would it be? What would you say to somebody? This is a story about, a boy meets a girl and he falls in love and then he loses the girl and then he gets the girl back. That's an old cliche, but that is a story. And where does that sentence begin? Where does that story begin? That begins when he meets her. So if you look at your logline, your elevator pitch, if you have one, and you should have one, you should be able to tell people in a sentence or two even before you write it, what your story is about, what your idea is for your story. When you tell people that, where do you start? That's probably the natural place where your story should start. Every once in a while, you'll get to the end or you'll get to the middle and you'll say to yourself, oh, gee, this needs to start in a different place. every once in a while that happens, but most of the time, that innate ability for us to tell a story is accurate, and most of the time, your instincts about where to start your story are good. So, what I teach and what a lot of people do instinctively when they write a story is, you could say, what's the arc of your story, but you could also say, what's the beginning, the middle, and the end. So that log line is usually your beginning, you know. Then maybe another sentence about what's the middle, and then maybe another sentence about what's the end. And as you begin to work this story out, you're gonna work your way from your beginning to your middle, and then from your middle to your end, and that's the way you're gonna craft your story. So knowing that beginning, middle, and end is a good place to start. Um, uh, and also, a lot of pundits along the way have given us a lot of advice about where not to start your story. I was slapped on the hand by an agent for starting one of my novels with somebody waking up. She said, never, ever, ever do that. She said, because it's cliche, because I see it all the time, because you naturally think, well, I'm starting a story, so let's start the story where this character wakes up and begins a day. She said, it's cliche, it's done all the time, don't do it. I don't think that means you can't do it. You'll discover as we talk along today, I'm not much for rules. You must have you must have your inciting incident by page 3. You must have your first conflict by page 7. Your character must realize he's going in the wrong direction or she's going in the wrong direction by page 30. I don't believe in any of that. So is it true that you can never ever start a story with people waking up? No. But again, as she, slapped me on a hand for, it's a cliche. Can you do something different? Also, it's suggested we not begin with backstory. Don't start by explaining how we got to where the story begins. You can get back to that later, but where do you want to start? Start there. Don't start, many people say, with an explanation of the story you're about to tell, which is often called a prologue. A lot of publishers are not fond of prologues. Again, there are exceptions, and we'll talk about them in a minute. But again, where does your story start? And does it need the crutch of some explanation first? And if so, why? Why not just start at chapter 1? Again, there are always exceptions, but the pundits out there, don't start with waking up, don't start with backstory, don't start with a prologue. And I'm a big fan of Elmore Leonard's. May he rest in peace. His rules, his 10 rules of writing. I should find them, and maybe I will before we're done. I'll find them and I'll put them up for you. Are classic and simple. And one of his 10 rules is never start with a weather. So there you are. Things not to start with. If you do choose to have a prologue, ask yourself this question. What's in my prologue that couldn't simply be chapter 1? Why am I choosing to have a prologue? As I said, many publishers don't like them. Many readers, again, people who do surveys tell us this, many readers skip them. They skip to chapter 1. So what is it that you believe is important in your prologue? Now, again, there are exceptions. Game of Thrones starts with a prologue. The Dream of Thieves, which many of you may not know, but which is a good work, starts with a prologue. Romeo and Juliet, for goodness sake, starts with a prologue. The friar comes out and says, 2 households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona, and he tells the whole story and then says, now watch that in our play. So there are famous prologues out there. I'm not saying you can't have one, but if you choose to write a prologue, ask yourself why. And if you trust your answer, go ahead. If you have information, for example, that you think the reader needs but doesn't fit into your first chapter, write the prologue. If not, start with chapter 1. Okay. Now, what makes a good opening? What world are you creating? Is this in the future? Is it science fiction? Are we on some other planet? Is this the past? Is this the Old West? Is this the present? And if it's the present, what part of the present are we looking at? What city What lens are we viewing that city through? What world are you starting in? Even if it's literally the world we live in today, what part of that world are you starting with? How are you choosing to show that to us? That should be part of your opening. To be only slightly hyperbolic, your opening wants to grab the reader by the throat. You want to have them wondering what's going on, and maybe you want to have them working to catch up. What the heck is happening? We're in a cockpit of a plane. The pilot is telling someone who in the co-pilot seat who's clearly never done this before what to do. We don't know why the pilot's not flying. We don't know who this person is who clearly doesn't know how to fly, but we know that this plane is going to crash if they don't figure this out. We can learn the rest later. That's an opening that grabs you by the throat. Okay. You can also open more lyrically. You might describe the beauty of where we are. All apologies to Elmore. You might start that, but if you have the ability to write that with such poetic beauty that it grabs us, okay, go ahead. And you can open with dialogue, but there are concerns. There are guidelines. We won't call them rules. There are guidelines when you choose to open with dialogue, and here they are. If you're going to open your with dialogue, if you're in that plane and the pilot is saying no, not that one, pull the other one, whatever it is, do we understand who your main character is? Within the dialogue, do we know who that is? Do we understand the context that we are in a plane and the pilot, for whatever reason, is not flying and the person who is flying doesn't know what they're doing? Can you convey that through what that pilot is saying? Can you convey all of that? You probably can. Can you suggest what is the conflict? In this case, the conflict is if this person who doesn't know how to fly can't do this, this plane is going to crash. That's the conflict that begins your story. If you choose to open with dialogue, you want to keep the number of speakers small. And you want to make sure that, again, most of the time you want to make sure that they are characters who are going to be important. We don't know, we the reader know nothing. We've opened to page 1. So the person saying, pull that lever, no that lever, if we're never going to see that person again, that person is perhaps not important. And do you want to give your opening dialogue to a person that we're never going to see again? Maybe you do. Maybe that pilot's going to die in the crash and maybe we'll never see him again. But again, these are things to be aware of if you begin with dialogue. And you want to give your characters distinctive voices, so that we can tell one from the other, especially, always in your novel, you want to do that, but especially in your opening. We want to be able to tell who your characters are. Even if there wasn't an attribution, we should know who they are by the way they speak. And the best way to do that, which is actually not part of this lecture, but another talk, is the Bible that you create. You should sketch out who these characters are. Who's your main character? What are his or her faults? What are their blind spots? What are their goals? What makes them the way they are? Why are they afraid of spiders? What happened to them when they were 5? A lot of that might never make it into your novel, but it will be what makes for you this not a character in your novel, but a living, breathing person whom you know. When you know that about them, writing their voice that's distinctive from the other characters becomes much, much easier. But as I said, that's a whole separate chat. Here are some things not to do if you choose to open with dialogue. Be careful of talking heads. Talking heads is that phrase we use for when it's only dialogue back and forth and there is no action and we don't get a sense of where we are or what's going on or who is doing what, because all we have is the words they are saying. Every rare once in a while that can work well but it probably doesn't work well in your opening because we don't know who these people are. We don't know where we are. We don't know what we are. If it's rare that we would learn that much in only dialogue. We probably need the other parts, which we're going to get to in a minute, of your narrative besides the dialogue. One of Elmore Leonard's rules also is Elmore famously said, dialogue in fiction, dialogue is the way people really talk with the boring parts cut out. And he's absolutely right about that. Again, it's been a good long. I was writing television 30 years ago, and my mentors had been in the business for a good long time, and they called it, and some of you will recognize this reference. They called it the Ozzie and Harriet syndrome. And for those of you who remember Ozzie and Harriet way back when Ricky and David came home from school, it was, hi, Mom, hi, Ricky, hi, Dad, hi, Ricky, hi, Mom, hi, David, hi, Dad, hi, David. It was, here's the, again, in television, we say about any scene, come in late. What's the latest you can come into this scene? And again, the example was, the cops going to interview the little old lady who saw the mugging in the grocery store. There's a knock on the door. Hello, officers. Can I help you? Yes, Mrs. McGillicuddy? Why, yes, that's me. This is Officer Jones, and I'm Officer Smith. We understand that you saw the mugging. Why, yes, I did, officers. Would you like to come in? Why, certainly. Officers, can I get you some tea? Yes, ma'am. I guess that would be very nice. Now, Mrs. McGillicuddy, can you tell us what you saw? If you opened with them holding teacups and Mrs. McGillicuddy saying, it was awful, he came out and he just hit that lady on the head, we would understand all that part that we skipped. Knocking on the door, coming in, introducing yourself. You can skip all that. Dialogue is the way people really talk with the boring parts cut out. Okay. Again, the talking heads thing is another reference for that is making sure you're not talking in a vacuum. Do we know where we are? Do we know what's happening? Do we know the action that is surrounding your characters? And that's difficult to do with dialogue alone. Not impossible, but difficult, and especially tricky if you're opening that way. And any time in any dialogue, be careful of overusing names. Bob, pull the handle. Not that handle, Bob, the other handle. Ray, I'm trying. It won't come up. I'm telling you, Bob, you just got to pull harder. Ray, I can't. Again, a lot of us write this way. A lot of us, everything I'm going to say, I'm probably as guilty of as all of us are in a first draft. And if you permit the vulgarity, Hemingway was absolutely right. Hemingway said, all first drafts are shit. Nobody but you should ever read your first draft. If you're in a critique group, if you're in a writer's group, if you have somebody you can share this with before you send it out, don't show them that first draft, because you want to put that away for a bit and you want to come back and you want to read it again and you want to look for the places where Bob and Ray are using their names too often, or where there's too much dialogue without enough action, or etc. You might not spot those things as you're literally writing those words for the first time, but you want to be able to look for them on a read through before you show it to anybody else. Okay. So, however you open, grab your reader's attention, and remember that before any reader picks up your novel, it has got to get through those gatekeepers. Your agent, or these days, the reader for your agent, or one of the readers for your agent. There are agents out there. We're not going to talk about much of this tonight, because self-publishing is this whole thing, and even querying an agent is a whole different talk. But those of you who've done this know when you finish it, and when you've made it the best you can, and when your critique group has critiqued it for you, and you're ready to send it off, you're sending a query to an agent, and most agents who are doing well in this business are getting between 15 and 50 queries a day. And most agents are not reading all of those themselves. They have some secretary or some assistant. If you go to an agent's website here are the agents. There's Bob and Mary and Sue are their agents. And here are these people down here, and they are the assistants or whatever they're called. They're not called secretaries. Those are the people reading your query. And those are the people passing on 3 or 4 or 5 a day to the agent for the agent to say yes or no to. Those are the gatekeepers. You need to get past them. You need to get past the agent. You need to get to the editor at your publishing house and get past them. And you need to get past the publisher. And when I say get past, you need to convince them that they need to publish your book. And to do that, your opening needs to grab them by the throat. Whether that's lyrical, beautiful, poetic writing, or whether that's the plane about to crash, whatever your version of that is, you need to do that, which is why your opening is so important. Okay, let's move on to setting your scene. First of all, let's talk a bit about outlining. Most of us outline. In television, that's a craft all by itself. They teach classes. I used to teach classes simply on outlining alone. In novel writing, you kind of do that as you go. There are people who kind of outline as they go. There are people who outline the whole novel before they start. There are people who don't outline it at all, and I know some of them, and they're on a different planet. But however you do this, when you sit down to think about the scene you're about to write, and you could probably break chapters down into scenes. Here are the questions you should ask yourself. We in television we call this the Big Four. Where are we? Who is here? What are they doing? What are they saying? If you sketch that out in your outline and then when you sit down, you know what this scene is about, you know what this chapter is about, you know where it's going, and you know what you want to happen. And I will guarantee you, if you do outline, it is so much easier to say, oh, this scene should come earlier in your outline, or it should come later, or you know what, I don't think I need this scene at all because we're going to learn this stuff later and we don't want to say it twice. It's so much easier to make those changes in your outline than it is in your draft. Especially because you've just spent the week writing this chapter, and then you say to yourself, you know what, maybe this isn't the right place, maybe I shouldn't be mentioning this stuff now, but I have already written it, so I'm going to leave it the way it is. And no, your work has to be absolutely the best you can make it. And again, maybe you outline, maybe you don't, but I'm just saying it's easier to make those adjustments in your outline, to see the structure in your outline, to alter that structure in your outline than it is in your draft. It also it takes less time, and it's less painful. It's less painful to say, you know what, I'm scrapping this because we'll come back to it later. And you're not throwing out a chapter you've just written. You're throwing out a couple of paragraphs you wrote. So I do suggest starting with an outline and looking at each of those scenes. Again, a chapter may be a single scene by itself, or it may be made up of 2 or 3 locations and 2 or 3 scenes. But anytime we're sitting in a location, we're going to call that a scene. In novels, there are 3 elements that make up almost every scene. They are dialogue, action, and narration. And hopefully those are self-explanatory. Dialogue is dialogue. It's what people say to each other. Action is the action that happens either between those lines of dialogue or on those lines of dialogue. He walks to the window. He mixes a drink. He sits on the couch. He sighs and holds his head in his hands. Those are all actions. And there's narration. He worries that if he sits down on that couch, he's never going to feel like getting up again, is the voice of your narrator telling us what he is thinking, what he is feeling, or what she is thinking and what she is feeling. And those 3 mixed together are often the structure of just about any scene. And again, you might have a scene that's only 2 of those 3, but often your writing is best. Your writing is flowing the best when you're combining all three. And it's another thing maybe you're not conscious of as you're writing it the first time, but when you go back, when you pick it up the next day and read this is the way I write. I usually start my writing morning with reading what I wrote yesterday. I'm looking for typos but or things that don't make sense. But I'm also just getting into the flow of the structure so I can move on from where I left off. And when you do that, is a time to look for, am I using too many? Am I using too many the names of the characters? Or how is the action in the dialogue? How are they combining with the narration to tell the story I want to tell? Okay. Also, again, I have no doubt that any of you who've been doing this for more than 5 minutes have heard this before, but make use of the senses. What people hear, what we hear them say, and what people see, the action that they're looking at are easy. What about the other ones? Is that right engine on fire in that plane we were talking about? And is that cockpit filled with smoke? And what does that smell like? Is it hot? What does that feel like? Is the window broken and icy wind is blowing in? What does that feel like? Look for places. Again, you might not do this on your first draft, but look for places to include, besides what people hear and what they see, what do they smell? What does it feel like? Where you can, what do they taste? He picked up the drink and realized it wasn't what he thought it was. What is that? Where can you include those senses? Because those senses evoke something in the reader. And that's what you want. Okay. All right. Let's talk for a minute about scene structure itself. And again, one of the guidelines, we won't call them rules, is too much of anything calls attention to itself. Too much names back and forth calls attention to itself. Any word, especially a word that's a little unusual. If you said he walked into the room and it was evocative of his childhood, you probably don't want to use that word evocative again, maybe ever in this novel, because unusual words call attention to themselves. But any word, really, he was really happy to see her and he really wanted to tell her how much he loved her and he was really afraid that she might not. You want to look, you could even do I do this, you can do a global. How many times did I use the word really in this chapter? How many times did I use the word just in this chapter? Word, if you're working on Word and other programs, will tell you, oh, you used it here, 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 and here. That's probably too many. So you want to look for anything any words, phrases that he found it hard to. Again, if that's a phrase you use more than 2 or 3 times, it's going to call attention to itself. But beyond words, unusual words, or just words you use too many, what other things do you replicate that you use too often? Sentence structure is one. He did this, he did that, he walked here, he stood there. The sentence structure is the same. Beyond that pronoun that begins every single one of them, the structure itself, the subject-verb structure is the same. And again, you might not catch that when you're writing the first draft, but as you're going through the next day or whenever you review your work, you want to look for things like this. Can you break that sentence structure up? Tom walked into the bar. He noticed a gorgeous blonde across the room staring at him. He gathered his courage and crossed to her. That is beginning with either Tom or the pronoun for Tom in every single one. It's subject, verb, too many pronouns. So, Tom walked into the bar. Across the room, a gorgeous blonde stared at him. Gathering his courage, he crossed to her. You've mixed up the subject, verb, and where you place those pronouns, so they're not the same. Okay. Also, it's just talking about structure, know where to break your paragraphs. The obvious one is there are the dialogue and action for Tom goes in one paragraph, and if he were talking to that gorgeous blonde, her dialogue and action would go in another paragraph. This would be true even if she said nothing. Tom walks up to her and says, "Hi, come here often?" And if she simply gives him a baleful stare, that is her reaction. So that would go in its own paragraph. And then Tom would say, "Oh, I'm really nervous and I'm sorry, that was a corny line." And that goes in his own paragraph. So one way to break up your paragraphs is the action and the dialogue of one character versus another. Another way to break up your characters is, again, back to that word, scenes. Tom gets out of his car on the hot, dusty day and stares at the restaurant and gathers his courage and walks up those steps. When he steps inside, it is cool and inviting and there's soft music playing, and that's a new paragraph. We're in a new place. So how to break your paragraphs, again, in general, break them up for who is talking and what they're doing, and break it up for when your characters move from place to place, or when your situation moves from place to place. And if it's a stronger move than simply Tom on the sidewalk or Tom inside, you may want to do your version of 3 asterisks in the center of the line that say we're changing scenes completely here. Now we're somewhere else, or now it's 4 hours later, or whatever it is. You can indicate passages with something that's slightly stronger than simply a paragraph break. Okay. Another thing about structure, use active verbs, not passive verbs. Again, I'll tell you a funny story in just a minute about passive verbs, but here's an example of passive verb overuse. A lamp was on the table, and the lamp's glow was soft. Music was playing, and the smell of honeyed wine was in the air. That's a nice image, but there's 4 passive verbs was in that, and you don't need any of them. It could be, a lamp stood on the table, giving off a soft glow. Music played, and the smell of honeyed wine filled the air. This is subtle, but those are active verbs, not passive verbs. Those verbs are subtly driving your story ahead instead of hovering, doing nothing on their own, because is or was literally by definition does nothing on its own. So look to, again, maybe not something you do on the first when you're writing those words for the first time, but on the next pass through, look to replace those passive verbs when you can. Now here's my funny story. I have over the years gone to countless symposiums and whatnot regarding writing. I used to go every single year to the Festival of Books when it was at UCLA. I'm a member of the SCBWI, the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. I go to their conferences every year. They just charge up my batteries. People just tell me, keep at it, keep going, you can do it, don't give up. And it's worth the money to go and have somebody tell me that. Anyway, at one, I don't remember where, I don't remember who, it's probably just as well, but this guy said you should never, ever, ever use the word was. I want you all to go through your novel, and every single time you use the word is or was, I want you to cross it out and do something else. And I did that. It took months, but I did it. And I put that novel away and I worked on another one, and I came back and I was reading this and I'm thinking, why is this sentence so convoluted? Why have I, my gosh. And then I realized, oh, it's so I don't say was. And I put several of them back because there's nothing wrong with that verb. It's a perfectly good verb. And if you're going to twist yourself into a pretzel to keep from using it, don't bother. It's, again, one of those things, there are no hard and fast rules as far as I'm concerned. But back to the example of the lamp was on the table. There are often better choices. Not always. Was and is are both perfectly good verbs, but often there are better choices. And that subtle little action of moving your story ahead with a little more oomph. Okay. Now, once you've written this scene, or as you're writing this scene, or if you're really lucky, as you're outlining this scene, here are some questions to ask yourself. How does this scene drive my story? Another question you might ask is, does it move the plot? That's asking the same question. Does it tell us more about this character or these characters? In a perfect world, the answer is yes to both of those questions. Does this drive my plot? Does it tell us more about our characters? Every scene, ideally, could do both, but pretty much needs to do one or the other. If you're reading this scene, or if you're reading the outline of this scene, and you ask yourself that question, how does this drive my story, and what does it tell me about my characters? And the answer is, well, nothing, but it's this really interesting piece of information. It's not necessarily that you need to cut that scene, but you need to imbue that scene with one or the other of both of those things. Let it drive your plot, or let it tell us more about your characters. It shouldn't be just this interesting thing that you learned when you were researching for your novel and you want everybody else to know too. One of the dangers of research, you find out interesting things and you feel you have to cram them in. So ask yourself that question: why is this scene here? And again, there are days, I think for all of us, there are days when you sit down to write and the short version is you just don't feel like writing. On those days, do these kinds of things. Go through your scenes and say, how does this drive my story? And again, this should take you all of 5 minutes to do an 80,000 word novel, because the answer is you're looking for those scenes that stop you. How does this drive my story? Well, we find out that the plane's about to crash. That drives the plot. Okay, you're looking for the scenes where you don't know the answer. One of those days when you really don't feel like writing and you're asking yourself this question: how does this drive my story? How does this drive my story? How does this drive my story? You should just breeze through all of those, and you're looking for the speed bump. You're looking for the place where you go, oh, gee, I'm not sure how that drives my story. Okay. And then you're looking to see what you can bring to that scene that does drive the story. In your scenes, especially your early scenes, there's going to be exposition. You're going to be stopping to explain things. You or your characters, either the narrator or the characters themselves, are going to tell us where we are and what's going on and how your characters are intertwined. A couple of things about this. You don't need to do it all at once. You can salt in who knows who and how they know who and what. You don't need to stop in the middle of that plane about to go down to explain what that passenger was doing before she came in and sat at the co-pilot's seat, and et cetera, and why the pilot is unable to fly the plane right now. You can give us little bits and pieces of that, but you don't need to stop the story to explain it all to us at one time. And again, it's that thing that maybe you're asking yourself on a second pass through. Gee, there's a whole lot of information here, even physical characteristics. The pilot is gray-haired. He has age spots on his hand. He kind of shakes a little, and maybe he should have lost his pilot license years ago. You don't need to tell us that all at once. You can salt that in as we go along. Okay, and this is back to the mix of exposition, which is stopping to tell us who's who and what's what, and action in your story. It's combining the two, so we don't even notice. We don't even notice that you're stopping to explain things to us because we're involved in your story already. And the danger is if you stop too long to explain too much, we're going to notice. Okay. Let's talk about setup, payoff. Again, it's a trope you've probably all heard. You set things up, you hit them again, you pay them off. The simple explanation is, without a setup, your payoff doesn't ring as resonant as it might. And without a payoff, you've set us up. If you're paying attention, it's the here's an example of a setup without a payoff. At the policeman's bar, where all the policemen go to unwind, the sergeant walks in, and the bartender sees him and turns around and pours 5 shots of tequila. And the sergeant sits down and they chat for a minute. He pours him a beer. He drinks the beer. He says, "See you later." He walks out. What the heck were the 5 shots of tequila for? That's a setup without a payoff. But perhaps more important to your story is making sure that your payoff is set up. And here's a story. Here's the puppy story to sort of highlight this. We have mom and dad in the front seat of the car driving home, and in the back is little Jimmy. He's 7 years old, and next to him is the puppy. And the puppy is obviously brand new, and Jimmy is thrilled that he has a puppy, and the puppy's name is Lucky. And they pull into the driveway, and Jimmy opens the back door and says, "Come on, Lucky, come on, we're home now, come on." And the puppy jumps out, is startled by something, runs into the street, and is hit by a car. That's a sad story. But it has not the proper setup, I might suggest. If we go back in that story and we meet Jimmy and his parents in the hospital, and the doctors are saying, that's all we know how to do. Take him home. Enjoy the time you have with him. And mom says, "I'm going to go get him that puppy that he's always wanted. And we always said we didn't have time to train a puppy. I'm going to go get it right now before we leave this hospital." And as they're setting up to release little Timmy, mom goes out, buys the puppy, brings him back, puts him on the bed, and Timmy perks right up and says, "This is the best day of my life. I'm going to call you Lucky. You're the luckiest thing that ever happened to me." And the doctors are amazed because before their eyes, he seems to be improving. They keep him for a couple more days. Lucky stays in the bedroom with him, in the hospital room with him. And the next time they're talking to the parents, they're saying, "Take him home, but he's in remission. We have no idea, but bring him back in a couple of weeks and we'll see how he's doing, but take him home." Now we're in that car. Now we drive into that driveway. Now he gets out of the car. "Come on, Lucky, come on." And now the dog gets hit by a car. The payoff is more vital because of the setup, because we know what Lucky means to Timmy. Setup, payoff. Your payoffs will be more impactful to your reader when you have set them up. Okay. Going back to outlines for just a minute, there is no rule. I'm not even sure there's a guideline for how long your outline should be for a novel. I don't know that anybody, maybe somebody out there is having rules for that. Who knows? But I will say this. Anytime you're sketching out a scene that you want to write, the more detail you can put into the outline within reason, probably the better, the easier it's going to be to write that scene. When you have made those Bibles, when you start with, before you write, again, I really encourage you to do this. Make a Bible for your characters. Who did they date at the prom? Who has loved who since the big football game in high school? What makes these people who they are? Know that about them first, and then when you sketch this scene out, if you the details that you can put in about how they do what they do in that plane, the detail, the right engine is on fire, the window is broken and icy air is rushing in, the woman in the co-pilot seat is 85 and frail. I mean, the more details you can put in that outline, the easier it's going to be to write that scene. Okay. Now, in addition to setup, payoff, there is a guideline that says save the best for last. Obviously, in the arc of your story, the most important, most vital, most critical scenes are going to be at the end of the book. because you have set us up with the whole story of who these people are and why what they're trying to do is so important and what the stakes are for how they. But that rule, save the best for last, is also true for your chapter. The end of the chapter should be the best part of the chapter, should be the part that makes us want to read the next chapter. In a scene, the dialogue, the most important dialogue should be at the end. And if it's not, you want to, if he says in the middle of a scene, I'm not sure I ever loved you, what are they possibly going to be talking about after that? You save the best for last. There are notable exceptions, but they're usually comedic. You probably all know the Harry Potter series, either the books or the movies. But when Hermione and the boys have just narrowly escaped the three-headed dog, and they get the dog back and they close the door, Hermione turns to them and says, let's go to bed before one of you does something to get us killed or worse, expelled. That's funny because to Hermione, being expelled would be more important than dying. But normally you would put that in the opposite order. And again, here's another example. We have a boyfriend girlfriend. They aren't living together, but they've been talking about living together. And they're at her apartment, and she says, I don't think you should stay here. My mom's coming for a visit. I'm pregnant with another man's baby. I'm not sure I love you. Now, change that order. Boyfriend is standing there talking about moving in, and she says, I don't think you should do that. I'm not sure I love you. I'm pregnant with another man's baby, and my mom is coming to visit. Again, it's if the scene is funny, that falls into the Hermione Harry Potter example, but otherwise you haven't saved the best for last. The impact of, as we said earlier, I'm not sure I ever loved you. In the middle of an argument, one of the partners says that to the other partner. That's the end of the scene. That's the deal breaker. Maybe you have a coda, maybe you have a I'm out of here or something, but maybe you don't even have that. So look at the structure of your dialogue, your chapters, the arc of your story, and save the best for last. Okay. This sort of circles back to something we were talking about a minute ago, but there are two questions you can ask at the end of every scene, probably after you write it and maybe before you rewrite it. What's the goal of this scene? Why is the scene here? And did I accomplish that goal? Again, one of those things when you really don't feel like writing, go through your scenes and ask yourself these questions. A slightly harsher way to look at that. A slightly harsher way to look at that is every scene necessary? Is this scene necessary? Again, this is a tough business. One of the things that charges my batteries every time I hear somebody say it. I heard Kwame Alexander say this at a SCBWI conference not that long ago. He said we all need three things to be successful as writers. We need talent, we need persistence, we need luck. And he said, and I've heard others say before, there's really only one of those you can control. I would quibble the talent thing, because talent, yes, but you can learn the craft of your writing, and you can add to your talent, but by the way you craft your story. But he's absolutely right. There's nothing you can do about the luck. We get lucky or we don't. The agent reading your stuff picks it up when he's in a good mood or a bad mood. He picks it up when he's really is wants to be out the door, or he picks it up when he's eager to read what you have to say. Um, that's the luck, and there's nothing you can do about that. Um, but saying all that and knowing that the good agents, I hate to put it that way, but the more popular agents, the agents that are getting more of their authors on the New York Times bestseller list, those guys are getting 30 queries a day. And your stuff has to be. When I was writing in television, a writer who was more successful than me, not that I'm turning green or anything, um, but he used to say the price of admission to do what we do is perfection. What I tell my students, I think that's a little hard to hear, especially if you're new to this. But what I tell my students uh, is the Mrs. Fields cookie story. When she, maybe you know, maybe you don't. Mrs. Fields wanted to open her own cookie shop, and uh, and they had enough disposable income that she saw this little tiny storefront, and she said, I want to open my cookie shop there." And her husband said, "I will fund you if you sell $50 worth of cookies your first day. But if you don't, I'm not going to fund you beyond the first month." And she baked all the cookies and she opened and she got the store all cleaned up and she sat there with her freshly baked cookies and not a single person came in. And it was getting to the end of the day and she'd sold like $5 worth of cookies. She took out to the next group of cookies that came out of the oven, still hot, still warm. She walked them out on a platter and said, "Free cookies." And she made $50 within the next 2 hours, and the rest is history. But what she says is good enough isn't. When you're looking at your story, you instinctively know already. My muse, she doesn't have a name. She's just Muse on my shoulder. She sits on and she whispers in this ear, and she says things like, "This chapter needs a stronger ending. You need something bigger here." She says, "This dialogue about the roses, which roses he's going to pick, that goes on too long." She says that, and if I listen to her, usually I'm right, and if I don't listen to her, in my critique group is saying, that the end of this chapter needs to be stronger. And I'm saying, yes, you're right. I know, because Little Muse already told me. But anyway, all of that is to say, trust your instincts, but make your story the best it can be. And when you're asking those questions, does this scene drive my story? Think of Mrs. Fields, good enough isn't. Think of that fellow who did so much better than I did. The price of admission is perfection. Your story has got to be the best you know how to make it, and you can't settle. Put your heart on your sleeve, write the story you really want to write it with emotion that tears our hearts out, and you'll probably be fine. Now, back to that little voice. A quick note about story fatigue. This is another interesting story. I was on a panel at UCLA years ago, and there were three of us who had written pilots. And if you don't know, a pilot is the first episode of a new series. And we were talking to a bunch of students who wanted to take classes to learn how to write pilots, and we started talking about it. In my experience on the shows I had worked on, I knew about this thing called story fatigue. Story fatigue is when you get sick of your own story, and especially the older writers that I'd worked with all recognized it and all knew the danger it was, because then you want to throw the whole thing out. And what was interesting on that panel was the other two panelists were talking about the same thing, but on their shows they had it by different names. We realized we were talking about the same thing, we just had different names for it. But it is when that little voice says, this whole thing sucks. What you should do, take it out, put it on a barbecue, light it on a bonfire, and roast marshmallows, because that's really the best thing you can do with this story. That's when you stop listening to that little voice. That little voice has gone tired and crabby, and you don't want to listen. Now, there are two tried and true ways to get over story fatigue. One is put the story in a drawer, work on something else, come back to it with fresh eyes later. And you can't always do that. If you're in a class, for example, a novel writing class where you're expected to write a chapter a week, or if you should be so lucky as to have a deadline, a publisher says, I want this by May 5th, you might not have time to put it in a drawer. The other tried and true way to conquer story fatigue is to remind yourself why you chose to write this story in the first place. Most of us, as writers, have a dozen ideas floating in our heads. You picked this one. Why? Remind yourself of that. If you find yourself thinking, just isn't working, remind yourself why you chose to write this story in the first place, and see if you can get that little voice to stop being so crabby. Real quick, you've all heard this before, show, don't tell. He is sad is telling us. Also, it's a passive verb. How can you show us? He angrily walked out of the house is telling us. He stormed out of the house, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled, is showing us that anger. Look where you can to show us and not tell us. Remember that we don't see, by the way, what you don't show us. You know where people are in a room. You know what their relationship is. You know what they're feeling. But if you don't tell us, we won't know. So be sure to include us in the things that you know about these characters and the way they relate to each other, and literally where they are. If she turns at the dinner table and talks to the man next to her, why doesn't everybody else at the table hear? Is she whispering? Is there some other raucous conversation going on? Is there some loud argument going on the other side of the table? What keeps everybody else at the table? You know, but we need to know. Make sure that we know. A quick word on backstories and flashbacks. Backstory is literally your character's past. John had grown up in this country. His father had been a logger, and John's grandfather before him. Until he started high school, John had never even been to another town. He had no concept of any other town except the one he'd grown up in. That is backstory. That's probably not where you want to begin. If you were going to begin that novel, a grab the throat would be John is 50 foot up in a pine and the wind is blowing and that pine is creaking and growing like it's going to go over any second. And later on we learn that he's the grandson of a logger and blah, 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 blah. So where you choose to give us your backstory and what you choose about the backstory, and do we care about John already? If we're with him in the top of that tree, if we're with that pilot in that plane, we already want to know a little more about them when we get to the backstory. But that's what backstory is. Again, so when we learn about him, what's our reason to care about him? We've probably already seen him on top of that tree. We've already seen him in that pilot seat. And as we already said, you can sprinkle what we know about him, what we learn about him over time. There can be a paragraph here, there can be a sentence here, there can be another sentence there. There doesn't have to be 3 paragraphs in a row. Okay.
Excuse me, Greg.
Flashback.
Okay.
Yes?
I'm sorry. I just I get the sense, and actually I've got a number of private emails that there's a number of questions, and I have a serious rewrite for everything I've done now. So I think at the appropriate time, Greg, we need to answer some questions.
All right. If we go over 90 minutes, I'm okay. But let me wrap up and we'll get to questions quickly. Okay. Just by definition, a flashback is a memory of one of your characters, and it needs to be triggered by something. If Alice is going down into her grandma's root cellar to get a jar of canned peaches, the flashback is when she was 4 years old and she went down there and nobody knew that she was down there and they closed the root cellar door and she was terrified. That's a flashback that's triggered by her experience of walking down there again. If she walks down there and thinks about her first date when she was in high school, what's the trigger? If on her first date they had a jar of they shared a jar of grandma's peaches, then that's the trigger for the flashback. But when you have flashbacks, they need to be triggered by what your character, what smell, what sight, what feeling, what quote reminds your character of that thing you want to flashback to. Okay. We've already talked about story arcs. What is your story arc? What's your beginning, middle, and end? How do you have a sense of, because we're coming to the end? How do you have a sense of knowing where your story is going to end? Do you have more than one? Has there been what they call a B story in your novel, or sometimes even a C story? And how do you wrap each of them together? And by the way, save the best for last. You want to wrap, if you did have, let's say, three different stories, you want to wrap up the C story, the one that's least important first. And then that B story, you want to save the A story for the end. You want to save the best for last. Take a look at Lord of the Rings. Take a look, by the time we get to the end of that third book, how many stories is Tolkien wrapping up? And in what order does he choose to wrap them up for us? Take a look at that if you want to look at how to wrap up, if you have more than but what's the place to end your main story? What have your characters accomplished, or what has your main character accomplished that that is fitting? What ending is going to be satisfying to us, your reader? How do you, and again, most of that you're doing instinctively, but I'm saying as you do it, take a look at the craft of how you do it. Take a look at how you wrap up, how you save the best for the end. What have you set up and set up that you pay off at the end? All these things that we've been talking about, how do you bring that to the end? Okay, let's get to those questions.